welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Episode 4, Jules Verne and the Roots of Sci-Fi in Adventure. So far, I've talked about satirical novels like Gulliver's Travels and horror stories like Frankenstein and how they influenced the beginning of science fiction, even though the genre as we know it didn't really exist yet. These were two roots of sci-fi that slowly put together the ideas to build it up over generations. Today, I want to talk about a third root of science fiction that provided its own flavor to the genre, adventure fiction. And to tell that story, there's no one better than one of the most famous and prolific authors on my reading list, Jules Verne. But in fact, Jules Verne contributed far more to the genre than a few adventure stories. He actually kind of invented it. Let's check it out. Adventure fiction was nothing new in the 1800s. The Travels of Marco Polo 5 centuries earlier was an adventure story about a man traveling to an exotic land that at the time might as well have been another planet. And according to some, it was just as fictional too, but that's another story. Gulliver's Travels was another travelogue. It's right there in the title. Utopia sort of was too. People like reading about adventures in strange, far-off lands, sometimes fantastic ones. But Jules Verne did it in a whole new way. Though he wasn't a scientist himself, he researched his novels heavily and wrote the latest science into them as accurately as possible. He understood the new technology of the industrial age and could envision new ways it could be used, like the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. Very little of what happened in his books was impossible at the time, and what was mostly due to scientific misunderstandings of his day. But it was still beyond anything ever imagined before, and that is some of the most classic sci-fi there is. One big exception to this is From Earth to the Moon. The science in that one is pretty bad. There's basically no way you could launch a spaceship to the moon with a giant cannon, and even if you could, it would turn the people inside into soup. The 200 tons of smokeless powder they loaded the cannon with could maybe get 25 pounds to escape velocity. Not the 10-ton aluminum shell they used. For comparison, the Saturn V rocket had over 2,000 tons of fuel, and that fuel was mostly kerosene, which is 10 times as powerful as smokeless powder. And that's only one problem. To get up to speed in only 900 feet would mean pulling over 20,000 Gs. That would be like a car slamming into a brick wall at Mach 3. I can give Verne a pass on the first point because rocket science didn't exist yet, but I have a hard time believing he didn't know better on the second one. It might be possible in the 1860s, but I doubt it. Anyway, for the most part, Jules Verne did revolutionize adventure fiction with his scientific rigor, and I would argue that is his greatest contribution to the genre, not the books themselves. Making modern science central to his books in this way was something new. Something that Jonathan Swift did only as a joke, and that Mary Shelley tried to do but didn't have the background for. Verne didn't write the first science fiction novel by most people's reckoning, nor did he create the genre as we understand it today. He did arguably come up with the idea of science fiction, though, what he called roman de la science, a novel of science, which was heavily based in scientific knowledge. This actually gave me pause when I learned it. On what basis can I say that H.G. Wells created sci-fi as a genre if Jules Verne came up with the idea? But I think the answer is that Verne didn't come up with the whole idea. Verne almost never invokes space aliens or time travel or weird, speculative experiments like Wells does. Instead, he invented what is now considered a subgenre of hard sci-fi, or perhaps scientific fiction. What TV Tropes calls 20 minutes into the future sci-fi after the 80s TV show Max Headroom. He advanced it far more than his predecessors, but he still didn't have the full story, so to speak. And this episode is mostly about Jules Verne, but he wasn't the only one writing sci-fi adventure fiction like this. Edgar Allan Poe's one and only full-length novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket from 1838, is sometimes considered science fiction. It features a voyage to Antarctica, a continent that had only been discovered in 1820, so almost nothing was known about it. Poe's version of the Antarctic is warm enough to support life and has a channel of water running all the way through it, and it's inhabited by natives who are black even to their teeth and are afraid of the color white because they've never seen it before. which has some unfortunate implications today, but regardless, it's proto-sci-fi of the same kind where people travel to a strange and alien land and describe it scientifically. Poe also dabbled with sci-fi ideas in some of his short stories, notably including The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, which includes a trip to the moon in a hot air balloon. Also, you should look up the story of Richard Parker from Arthur Gordon Pym. It's too long to tell it properly here, but it is fascinating and super creepy. Now, looking at Jules Verne's books, you see another reason why I don't consider him to have created sci-fi as a genre, and that is because he mostly didn't write sci-fi. 3 of his dozens of novels, interestingly 3 of his earliest, have become famous as what we now call science fiction. Journey to the Center of the Earth in 1864, From Earth to the Moon in 1865, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas in 1870. Some of his other works also qualify as science fiction, like Off on a Comet, but most of his work was straight adventure fiction, exploring the real world as it was known at the time, most famously in Around the World in 80 Days in 1872. As an aside, an awful lot of Verne's books have some of the most boring titles imaginable. A modern equivalent to Around the World in 80 Days would be something like Our Trip on a 3-Month Around-the-World Cruise. No reader interest whatsoever unless you're a fan of travelogues in the modern sense. It's amazing that his works have become so famous that we don't really notice that anymore. Let's look at these books. Journey to the Center of the Earth was only Verne's 3rd novel, after 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which described a trip to Africa, and The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, which described an expedition to the North Pole. But Journey to the Center of the Earth, as its amazingly literal title suggests, has a different destination in mind. In it, the brilliant geologist Professor Lindenbrock discovers a map that he believes leads to the center of the Earth. Spoiler alert, they don't actually make it to the center of the Earth. They do, however, wind up in a massive underground cavern hundreds of miles wide, complete with its own light source and weather patterns, and populated by dinosaurs. This is pretty impossible by today's standards. There are no great voids like this underground. We would have seen them on seismographs. But by the standards of 1864, it was a legitimate scientific theory, even if not a very popular one. And we already see some of Verne's applications of contemporary science and inventions, such as using Ruhmkorff lamps for light, which were a very early predecessor of neon lights, smokeless powder, then known as gun cotton, for blasting, plus a strong background for his time in sciences ranging from paleontology to cryptography to acoustics. Next, we have From Earth to the Moon. But this one is really 2 books. The original From Earth to the Moon, where the Baltimore Gun Club builds and fires the giant cannon, and Around the Moon, where the passengers travel, well, around the moon, and return to Earth. Both are pretty short, and they're usually packaged in a single volume. There's also a 3rd book set 20 years later, but it's much less famous and even sillier. The Baltimore Gun Club is a pretty blatant parody of Americans as gun nuts. It just goes to show that trope is older than you think. It's a club of wealthy weapons manufacturers looking for something to do after the Civil War, which ended mere months before Verne wrote the book. They decide to build a gigantic cannon big enough to shoot the moon and leave a crater that can be seen from Earth. Over-the-top one-upmanship eventually turns it into an attempt to send humans to the moon, still with a giant cannon. As I said, the science is a joke, but then again, the whole thing kind of is. It certainly takes a more light-hearted tone than his other adventures, but we still see a lot of the same technology, plus a serious and well-thought-out discussion of how to survive in space. But the real gem of Verne's body of work has got to be 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, a world tour underwater. And yes, the seas is plural, which actually clarifies the title. It's not talking about depth, it's distance. The Nautilus travels 60,000 miles around the world while under the seas. I think this is probably Verne's finest work, at least of his most famous books. What he creates in the Nautilus is something that would not be realized for 50 years, and not really for 100. A self-sufficient submarine, large enough to support a crew of dozens, designed for battle if need be, and electrically powered by a mysterious and very powerful source. In modern times it's been envisioned as nuclear-powered, but radioactivity hadn't been discovered yet. It seems to be meant to have been either a coal-powered generator, or more plausibly a hydrogen fuel cell. And it's not just the Nautilus as a submarine. The Ruhmkorff lamps come back to produce light by electricity. The incandescent light bulb did exist at the time, but it wasn't a practical invention until Edison's 1879 version. Verne also envisioned, among other things, air-powered rifles shooting electric bullets, decades before the taser was even imagined. Admittedly, the plot is still pretty much a travelogue, but it's still a fascinating story. The mysterious Captain Nemo, an exiled prince, is driven by vengeance against the unnamed empire that conquered his country. To do this, he builds the Nautilus in secret, vows never to set foot on inhabited land again, and uses it to sink quote-unquote enemy ships. When Professor Aronnax and his companions wind up aboard by accident, Nemo forces them to stay to keep his secret. For our heroes, it's a gilded cage, as they get to explore the underwater world in ways no one had imagined at the time, but they still hope for eventual escape. It sounds a bit thin given that most of that is backstory, but Verne pulls it off in spades. 20,000 Leagues has a sequel too, which you might have heard about, The Mysterious Island, in which Captain Nemo finally settles down on the titular island. Weirdly, this book reveals that Nemo was in fact an Indian prince exiled by the British Raj, something 20,000 Leagues never even hints at, and indeed, in the early drafts he was supposed to be Polish, but I think it makes for a fun little addition. And in addition to those books, I want to add one more note about one of Verne's less famous books. Remember Poe's Arthur Gordon Pym? Well, in 1897, Jules Verne wrote a sequel to it called An Antarctic Mystery, which is also pretty good. For those of you who want to read Jules Verne, there are a few details you might want to know. I've talked about issues of access in this podcast before, including for people for whom money might be a concern. For most modern books, it's often going to come down to your local library. But all of the books I've discussed so far are in the public domain and are available for free online. For example, from Project Gutenberg. But I want to add another piece to this for Jules Verne. You should be cautious about books that were not originally written in English because not all translations are equal. And for non-native speakers, you'll have to use your own judgment. To wit, all of Jules Verne's books were originally translated from French, and the early translations were not very good. Many translations of 20,000 Leagues cut about a fifth of the text and have numerous mistranslations. For one well-known example, look in Chapter 2, where Professor Aronnax describes returning from an expedition to Les Mauvaises Terres de Nebraska. Early translations rendered this with the literal translation of the disagreeable territories of Nebraska, but modern versions use the correct translation of the Badlands. I'm told one of the best translations of this book is the one made by F.P. Walter for the U.S. Naval Institute in 1993. But if you can't get that one directly, an earlier draft by the same translator is available for free online, so I would recommend you start there. Another interesting note for prospective readers is that today, many of Verne's novels are considered children's or young adult fiction. I'm not really sure why this is. They're on the short side, but they're not that short, and 20,000 Leagues is pretty long. And they're not known for what we generally call a low reading level either. Maybe it's just the stereotype that teenage boys like adventure fiction. I know I read them as a teenage boy and liked them, but that's also true of a lot of novels that aren't considered YA. Anyway, I encourage you to share them with your middle schoolers or high schoolers if you have some around. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available on Libsyn, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. I'm not entirely sure why people say that every time, since you've already found it here wherever you're listening, but if there's something more convenient for you in that list, go for it. My book recommendation of the episode, of course, is 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. It is this book where I think Jules Verne is most on his game with good science and advanced technology. Find a good translation and enjoy. Next episode, we see science fiction fully come together for the first time with H.G. Wells. Thanks for listening.